The summer of 1944. The Soviet-German front was frozen in tense anticipation. 3 years of bloody war had changed the balance of power beyond recognition. The Red Army, having passed through the crucible of defeats and retreats in 41, having stood firm in 42, and turned the tide of the war in 43, was now preparing to deliver one of the most devastating blows in the entire history of World War II. The operation, codenamed Bagration, was not just another offensive. It was planned as a strategic event capable of radically changing the situation on the Eastern Front. While the Allies were landing in Normandy, opening the long-awaited Second Front, the Soviet command was preparing a blow of unprecedented force against the Belarusian salient, a territory deeply wedged into the Soviet lines. Here, over an area of hundreds of kilometers, was Army Group Center, the most powerful formation of German troops, holding a strategically important section of the front. The Hitlerite command considered this group an impregnable bastion, against which any attempts at a Soviet offensive were supposed to break. No one in Berlin imagined that in just 2 weeks, only scattered remnants would remain of this army group, and the front line would shift 500 kilometers to the west. By the summer of 1944, the strategic situation on the Soviet-German front had radically changed. The winter-spring operations of the Red Army led to the liberation of right bank Ukraine, the breakthrough of the Leningrad blockade, and the advance of Soviet troops to the borders of Romania. German troops had been pushed back to the west, but continued to hold a significant part of Soviet territory. Against the backdrop of the general retreat of the Wehrmacht, the Belarusian salient stood out particularly. A vast territory deeply wedged into the disposition of Soviet fronts. This salient, resembling a balcony in shape, hung over the northern flank of Soviet troops operating in Ukraine and posed a constant threat to the communications of advancing armies. The Belarusian salient was held by Army Group Center, one of the most powerful formations of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The German command attached exceptional importance to this sector. Hitler personally ordered the territory of Belarus to be held at all costs, considering it the key to the defense of East Prussia, historical German territory. The Soviet command, analyzing the situation, concluded that it was necessary to eliminate the Belarusian salient. This would not only liberate a significant part of Soviet territory, but also create conditions for further advance to the west, to the borders of Germany, and into the countries of Eastern Europe. Furthermore, the defeat of Army Group Center would deprive the Wehrmacht of a significant portion of its combat-ready formations, and definitively undermine its ability to conduct strategic defense on the Eastern Front. At the headquarters of the Supreme High Command, the development of a plan for a large-scale offensive operation began. An ambitious task was set before the Soviet troops, not just to push the enemy out of their occupied positions, but to encircle and completely destroy the main forces of Army Group Center. To achieve this, it was planned to deliver powerful converging strikes, dissect the German defenses, and create kettles in which the enemy would be doomed to destruction. By the summer of 1944, Army Group Center represented a formidable force. Under the command of Field Marshal Ernst Busch were 4 field armies: the 3rd Panzer, 4th, 9th, and 2nd. In total, this comprised 40 divisions, including 5 Panzer and 2 motorized. The grouping numbered up to 500,000 men, armed with approximately 9,000 guns and mortars, 900 tanks and assault guns, and over 1,000 aircraft. Over 3 years of occupation, the Germans had created a deeply echeloned defense system in Belarus. Key cities were transformed into powerful centers of resistance. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk were surrounded by several lines of trenches, pillboxes, bunkers, and minefields. Defensive lines ran along the banks of numerous rivers: the Western Dvina, Dnieper, Drut, Berezina, creating natural obstacles for advancing troops. However, behind the outward might lay serious weaknesses. Firstly, the stretched front line, over 1,000 kilometers, did not allow for a continuous defense. Between fortified areas there were weakly protected sections, especially in marshy areas, which the Germans considered impassable for large formations. Secondly, the Belarusian salient had the shape of a huge balcony protruding eastward, which made the flanks of the army group vulnerable to attacks from the north and south. A Soviet offensive on the flanks threatened to encircle the entire grouping. Thirdly, the German command made a strategic miscalculation in assessing the direction of the main thrust. Hitler and his generals were convinced that in the summer of '44, the Red Army would continue its offensive in the southern direction, in Ukraine and Romania. Therefore, the main reserves and mobile formations were concentrated there, while Army Group Center experienced an acute shortage of tanks and assault guns. Field Marshal Busch repeatedly reported to Berlin about the insufficient manning of his troops and requested reinforcements, but Hitler remained adamant. He demanded that every meter of Soviet land be held, forbidding any maneuvering and retreat, turning cities into fortresses that were to be defended to the last soldier. The development of Operation Bagration's plan began in April 1944. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command entrusted the preparation of proposals to two outstanding military leaders, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. Each of them personally visited the front, studied the situation, and met with army and front commanders. The result of this work was a detailed plan, approved by Stalin at the end of May. The strategic concept of the operation was audacious and innovative. Instead of concentrating efforts on a single direction, it was planned to deliver 6 powerful blows along converging axes. 4 fronts: the First Baltic under Ivan Bagration, the Third Belarusian under Ivan Chernyakhovsky, the Second Belarusian under Georgy Zakharov, and the First Belarusian under Konstantin Rokossovsky, were to dismember the enemy's defenses and create several cauldrons. Konstantin Rokossovsky played a special role in the planning. At a meeting at the Stavka, he defended the idea of delivering 2 equally strong blows on his front instead of the single one proposed by Stalin. This was an unprecedented case. A front commander convinced the Supreme High Commander to change the initial design. Rokossovsky's decisiveness was subsequently fully justified. It was his front that achieved the greatest successes in the first days of the operation. Coordination of front actions was entrusted to Stavka representatives, Zhukov and Vasilevsky. The former was to direct the actions of the First and Second Belarusian fronts, the latter, the First Baltic and Third Belarusian fronts. Such a division ensured unity of command and allowed for prompt reaction to changes in the situation. An important feature of the plan was the extensive use of tank and mechanized corps to develop success. After breaking through the enemy's tactical defense zone, mobile formations were to rapidly advance deep into the enemy's rear, intercepting the retreat routes of German troops and closing encirclement rings. The preparation of Operation Bagration was a true triumph of Soviet military art. By the beginning of the summer of 1944, an unprecedented number of forces and resources had been concentrated in the directions of the main thrusts. 4 fronts comprised over 2 million personnel, 36,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and about 5,000 aircraft. For every kilometer of the breakthrough, Soviet command created an overwhelming superiority over the enemy, 3 to 4 times in manpower and 6 to 8 times in artillery and tanks. However, a simple accumulation of forces did not guarantee success. A grandiose disinformation operation against the enemy became a key factor. Soviet command created an entire system of false troop concentrations in the southern direction, in Ukraine and Moldova. Mock tanks and artillery were constructed, radio traffic was simulated, and demonstrative regroupings were carried out. At the same time, the actual concentration of troops in Belarus proceeded with strict adherence to camouflage. Troops moved only at night, hiding in forests during the day. Radio traffic was minimized, and commanders received orders only in written form or in person. Intelligence played a special role in the preparation of the operation. Aerial photography, the actions of reconnaissance groups, and prisoner testimonies allowed for the creation of a detailed map of German fortifications. But the real breakthrough was the involvement of Belarusian partisans. 140,000 people's Avengers transformed into a gigantic intelligence network. In the 2 weeks leading up to the operation alone, they transmitted over 1,000 reports to command about the location of German units, firing positions, minefields, and fortifications. The partisans not only gathered information, but also actively assisted the advancing troops. They seized and held river crossings, destroyed enemy communication lines, and guided Soviet units through swamps along hidden paths. And 3 days before the start of the offensive, they launched a real rail war, paralyzing railway traffic in the rear of Army Group Center. A few weeks before the start of Operation Bagration, the German rear turned into a zone of continuous partisan warfare. Belarusian forests and swamps became a real fortress for more than 140,000 Avengers of the people, united into 370 partisan detachments. Their role in the upcoming offensive can hardly be overestimated. The partisans were to become an invisible front that would paralyze German communications at a crucial moment. As early as April 1944, the central headquarters of the partisan movement developed a plan to coordinate the actions of the partisans with the advancing troops. Each detachment received specific tasks and areas of operation. Special attention was paid to railways, vital arteries for supplying Army Group Center. On the night of June 20th, 3 days before the start of the operation, explosions rocked all of Belarus. Operation Rail War began, the largest sabotage action in the entire history of World War II. In one night, partisans blew up more than 40,000 rails. Railway communication in the German rear was paralyzed. Echelons with reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel were stuck at stations. Repair crews attempting to restore the tracks were attacked. In addition to destroying railways, partisans destroyed bridges, communication lines, and warehouses. They set up ambushes on roads, attacked headquarters and garrisons. The intelligence information collected by the partisans was especially valuable. Thanks to their reports, the Soviet command received detailed information about the location of German units, firing points, and minefields. When the offensive began, the partisans moved to active combat operations. They captured and held river crossings until the arrival of regular units, led troops through swamps along secret paths, and pointed out bypass routes around enemy fortifications. In some areas, partisan brigades, numbering several thousand fighters, waged real frontline battles, drawing significant enemy forces upon themselves. The partisan movement in Belarus became a phenomenon unparalleled in the history of wars. Never before had a regular army had such a powerful and organized support force in the enemy's rear. Thanks to this invisible front, Operation Bagration gained an additional advantage, which ultimately played a decisive role in the swift defeat of Army Group Center. June 23, 1944. Exactly at 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the Belarusian forests and swamps was shattered by the roar of thousands of cannons. The artillery preparation for Operation Bagration had begun. Along a front of 120 kilometers, the earth trembled from exploding shells. A wall of fire and smoke rose over the German positions. Soviet artillery operated according to a new methodology. Instead of uniform shelling of the entire defense line, fire was concentrated on identified strongholds and resistance nodes. Artillery preparation lasted from 1.5 to 2.5 hours, depending on the direction. During this time, more than 4 million shells and mines rained down on enemy positions. When the artillery shifted its fire deeper into the defense, Hundreds of Soviet bombers appeared in the sky. Wave after wave they struck enemy fortifications, command posts, and artillery positions. The German troop control system began to collapse in the very first hours of the offensive. At 6 in the morning, infantry and tanks went on the attack. On the Vitebsk direction, troops of the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts advanced. The 43rd and 39th armies rapidly moved towards each other, creating a threat of encirclement for the enemy's Vitebsk grouping. On the Orsha direction, the 11th Guards Army of General Galitsky broke through the first line of defense and by the end of the day advanced to a depth of 8 kilometers. The Germans threw in their last reserves in counterattacks, but could no longer stop the Soviet offensive. On the Mogilev direction, troops of the 2nd Belarusian Front forced the Pranya River and seized bridgeheads on its western bank. The 49th Army of General Grishin broke through the enemy's first defensive line and advanced to a depth of 10 kilometers. The most impressive successes were achieved by the 1st Belarusian Front under the command of Rokossovsky. Delivering 2 powerful blows north and south of Babruisk, his troops advanced up to 20 kilometers deep by the end of the first day. The 65th and 28th Armies broke through the German defenses on the Drut River and created conditions for introducing General Pliev's cavalry mechanized group into the breakthrough. On June 24th, the offensive developed even more rapidly. The German command tried to transfer reinforcements, but railways destroyed by partisans and continuous strikes by Soviet aviation made this practically impossible. By the end of the second day, troops of the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts closed the encirclement around 5 German divisions in the Vitebsk area. The Vitebsk cauldron was the first crushing blow to Army Group Center. The operation to encircle the Vitebsk group of Germans began on the morning of June 23rd, when the troops of General Beloborodov's 43rd Army and General Lyudnikov's 39th Army launched an offensive from the north and south of the city. Soviet command skillfully identified weak points in the enemy's defenses, the junctions between the 3rd Panzer and 4th Armies of the Wehrmacht. The first day of the offensive brought significant success. Breaking through the tactical defense zone, Soviet troops advanced up to 10 kilometers deep. The German command, realizing the threat of encirclement, requested permission from Field Marshal Busch to withdraw troops from the Vitebsk salient, but received a categorical refusal. Hitler personally ordered the Fortress Vitebsk to be held until the last soldier. On June 24th, the pace of the offensive further increased. The 43rd Army turned its formations south and the 39th north. By the end of the day, advanced units of the 2 armies met in the area of the settlement Ostrovno, 20 kilometers west of Vitebsk. 5 divisions of the 53rd Army Corps, about 35,000 soldiers and officers, found themselves in the cauldron. Realizing the catastrophe, the commander of the encircled group, General Golvitzer, attempted to organize a breakthrough to the west. However, by this time, the encirclement ring was already saturated with anti-tank artillery and self-propelled guns. Several breakthrough attempts were repelled with heavy losses for the Germans. Field Marshal Busch made a desperate attempt to de-block the encircled troops. He hastily formed a battle group from units of the 4th Army and threw it eastward. However, these forces were insufficient for decisive action. Soviet troops created a strong outer encirclement front and repelled all enemy counterattacks. On June 25th and 26th, the systematic liquidation of the Vitebsk cauldron took place. The encircled German troops were dismembered into isolated groups and destroyed. By the evening of June 26th, enemy resistance ceased. Approximately 10,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner, including the commander of the 53rd Corps, General Golvitzer, and several division commanders. The rest died in battle. The defeat of the Vitebsk group had enormous strategic significance. A powerful center of resistance covering the direction to Polotsk and Minsk was eliminated. A 40-kilometer-wide breach formed, into which mobile formations of Soviet troops rushed. In addition, the German command lost 5 combat-ready divisions that could have played an important role in stabilizing the front. The Bobruisk direction became the arena of Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky's military art triumph. The First Belarusian Front, under his command, delivered 2 powerful blows, north and south of Bobruisk. This plan, defended by Rokossovsky in an argument with Stalin, fully justified itself from the first hours of the offensive. On the morning of June 23rd, after a powerful artillery preparation, 3 armies went on the attack: the 3rd, 48th, and 65th. They broke through the enemy's first line of defense and advanced up to 20 kilometers deep. The stunned German command could not organize effective resistance. The 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, defending this sector of the front, began to rapidly lose control of the situation. On June 24th, Rokossovsky brought his main trump card into battle: General Pliev's cavalry mechanized group and the 1st Guards Tank Corps. These mobile formations rushed into the created breaches, and by the end of the day, advanced up to 40 kilometers deep. The German command threw all available reserves into counterattacks, but could no longer stop the Soviet offensive. On June 25th, Soviet tankmen cut off all main retreat routes for the enemy's Bobruisk grouping. Pliev's cavalry mechanized group captured crossings over the Berezina River north of Bobruisk, and the 1st Guards Tank Corps reached the river south of the city. By the end of the day, the encirclement ring around 6 divisions of the 35th and 41st Army Corps closed. About 40,000 soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht found themselves in the cauldron. The commander of the 9th Army, General Jordan, requested permission to break out of the encirclement, but Field Marshal Busch, bound by Hitler's order to hold Bobruisk at all costs, refused. Only on June 27th, when the catastrophe became obvious, was belated permission to retreat given. However, by this time, Soviet troops had created a strong inner and outer front of encirclement. Attempts to break through led only to enormous losses. Soviet aviation continuously bombed concentrations of German troops. Artillery fired direct fire at enemy columns. By June 29th, the resistance of the encircled troops was broken. Only individual groups managed to break through to the west. Most of the Bobruisk grouping was destroyed or captured. The trophies of Soviet troops included hundreds of guns, dozens of tanks, and thousands of vehicles. The defeat of German troops near Bobruisk had strategic significance. The southern flank of Army Group Center was completely destroyed. A huge gap was formed, into which the tank and mechanized formations of the First Belarusian Front rushed. The road to Minsk and Baranovichi opened before them. The brilliant success of the operation in the Bobruisk direction became possible due to the skillful use of large tank and mechanized formations. They did not just support the infantry, but acted as an independent striking force, solving operational tasks. Rokossovsky masterfully used maneuver, concentrating forces in the directions of the main attacks and achieving a multiple superiority over the enemy in decisive sectors. The Bobruisk operation demonstrated the maturity of Soviet military art, the ability of the command to organize the interaction of various branches of service and conduct complex encirclement operations. By the end of June 1944, Operation Bagration was unfolding in the most favorable way for Soviet troops. After successfully breaching enemy defenses in the Vitebsk and Bobruisk directions, the decisive moment arrived. A swift advance towards Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian SSR. The Soviet command understood that the capture of this major transportation hub and administrative center would lead to the complete collapse of the central sector of Army Group Center's front. Tank and mechanized corps, introduced into the breach, developed the offensive at an unprecedented speed, up to 70 kilometers per day. General Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps and General Abakov's 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps rapidly advanced towards Minsk from the east, while General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps bypassed the city from the south. The German command found itself in a catastrophic situation. Field Marshal Busch, stunned by the scale of the Soviet offensive, lost control of the situation. On June 28th, Hitler removed him from his post, appointing Field Marshal Walter Model in his stead, known for his toughness and ability to organize defenses in the most difficult conditions. However, even the Reich's firefighter, as Model was called, could not stop the rapid advance of Soviet troops. Attempts to organize a retreat turned into a chaotic flight. Dispersed German units, cut off from communication with command, retreated along converging routes towards Minsk, where they hoped to organize a defense. However, Soviet tank wedges moved faster, intercepting the enemy's retreat paths. On July 3, 1944, advanced units of the 5th Guards Tank Corps and the 1st Guards Tank Corps linked up west of Minsk, closing the encirclement. On the same day, the capital of Belarus was completely liberated from the invaders. Universal jubilation reigned in the city. Residents, with tears in their eyes, met their liberators, embraced tank crews, and gave flowers to infantrymen. The remnants of the 4th and 9th Wehrmacht armies, about 100,000 soldiers and officers, found themselves in the enormous Minsk cauldron. These were demoralized troops, exhausted by continuous fighting, deprived of heavy weapons and ammunition. The German command made a desperate attempt to relieve the encircled group, but Soviet troops created a strong outer encirclement front and repelled all enemy counterattacks. The liquidation of the Minsk cauldron continued until July 11th. During this time, over 35,000 German soldiers and officers, including 12 generals, were captured. The rest perished in battles or scattered through the forests, where most of them were destroyed by partisans or taken prisoner in the following days. The Minsk cauldron became the culmination of Operation Bagration and a symbol of the complete defeat of Army Group Center. On July 3, 1944, when tankers of the 5th Guards Tank Corps and the 1st Guards Tank Corps linked up west of Minsk, a gigantic encirclement ring closed. Within this cauldron were trapped the remnants of the Wehrmacht's 4th and 9th armies, over 100,000 enemy soldiers and officers. Field Marshal Model, who had replaced the bewildered Busch as commander of Army Group Center, proved powerless in the face of this strategic catastrophe. The encircled German troops were demoralized by the swiftness of the Soviet offensive and the loss of command and control. Most units had lost heavy weapons and ammunition during the retreat. Attempts to organize an all-round defense were hampered by a lack of time and resources. The Soviet command methodically proceeded to eliminate the cauldron. The inner front of the encirclement was reinforced with rifle divisions, while tank and mechanized formations continued their offensive to the west, creating a strong outer front. Aviation continuously struck at concentrations of encircled troops, depriving them of the ability to maneuver. The German command made a desperate attempt to relieve the encircled grouping. Reserve units and formations, transferred from other sectors of the front, were hastily moved towards Minsk from the west. However, these forces were insufficient for decisive action. Soviet troops repelled all enemy counterattacks, inflicting heavy losses. Chaos reigned inside the cauldron. Communication between individual groups was disrupted, supplies ceased, and the wounded received no medical attention. The German command attempted to organize a breakout from the encirclement, but all attempts ended in failure. Soviet artillery fired directly at enemy columns. Tanks and self-propelled guns cut off breakthrough groups from the main forces. By July 7, the resistance of the encircled troops began to weaken. Individual units began to surrender. On July 8, the Soviet command issued an ultimatum for surrender, which was rejected by the German command. After this, the final phase of the cauldron's elimination began. By July 11, Organized enemy resistance in the Minsk cauldron ceased. The results of the operation to encircle and destroy the enemy's Minsk grouping were impressive. 35,000 German soldiers and officers, including 12 generals, were taken prisoner. Among them were Lieutenant General Tippelskirch, commander of the 4th Army, and General of Infantry Müller, commander of the 12th Army Corps. The trophies of the Soviet troops included hundreds of artillery pieces, thousands of vehicles, and a huge amount of military equipment. The Minsk cauldron became the largest defeat of the Wehrmacht since Stalingrad. In terms of the scale of encircled and destroyed forces, it even surpassed the Stalingrad catastrophe. Army Group Center effectively ceased to exist as a combat-ready formation. Germany lost 30 divisions, approximately 350,000 soldiers and officers. The Wehrmacht could no longer compensate for such losses. The liberation of Minsk had enormous political and moral significance. The capital of Belarus, under occupation for 3 long years, once again became Soviet. The city's residents, who had endured the horrors of the Nazi regime, greeted their liberators with tears of joy. For Soviet troops, the capture of Minsk and the creation of the Minsk cauldron became a triumph of military art. For the first time in the history of wars, an operation of such a scale was carried out, during which an entire enemy army group was completely destroyed, and an area of over 100,000 square kilometers was liberated within 2 weeks. After the defeat of the main forces of Army Group Center in the Minsk pocket, the Soviet command proceeded to exploit the success. The offensive continued with unabated force, as Field Marshal Model did not have sufficient reserves to create a continuous line of defense. The advanced tank formations of the Red Army moved westwards at a speed of up to 50 kilometers per day, not allowing the enemy to establish themselves on intermediate lines. On July 12th, Vilnius, the capital of the Lithuanian SSR, was liberated. On July 13th, Soviet troops entered Grodno. By mid-July, the First Baltic Front reached the approaches to East Prussia, and the First Belarusian Front reached the line of the Western Bug River, the state border of the USSR with Poland in '41. In a desperate attempt to halt the Soviet offensive, the German command transferred all available reserves to the Belarusian sector. Several divisions, withdrawn from confronting Anglo-American forces in Normandy, arrived from the Western Front. Tank formations were transferred from the southern sector of the Eastern Front. However, these measures could not fundamentally change the situation. Model tried to organize a defense along the Neman and Western Bug rivers, hoping to use water barriers to stabilize the front. However, Soviet troops, experienced in forcing water obstacles, quickly overcame these lines. Advanced detachments crossed on improvised means, captured bridgeheads, and then engineering units built pontoon bridges for the crossing of the main forces. By the end of July, Soviet troops had advanced to a depth of 250 to 400 kilometers from their initial positions. The territory of Belarus, a significant part of Lithuania, and the eastern regions of Poland were completely liberated. Advanced units reached the approaches to Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. The attempts of the German command to stabilize the front failed for several reasons. Firstly, catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment did not allow for the creation of a continuous line of defense. Secondly, the speed of the Soviet offensive deprived the enemy of time to prepare fortified lines. Thirdly, the demoralization of German troops reached a critical level. Many units lost their combat effectiveness and, upon first contact with Soviet troops, retreated without a fight. Operation Bagration became a triumph of Soviet military art. For the first time in the history of warfare, such a large-scale strategic operation was developed and successfully implemented, combining numerous innovative tactical and operational solutions. The main feature was the application of the artillery offensive concept. Instead of uniformly distributing guns across the entire front, Soviet command created ultra-dense artillery groupings in the directions of the main attacks. Up to 300 barrels per kilometer of breakthrough. At the same time, fire was concentrated not on the entire defense line, but on identified strong points and resistance nodes. Artillery preparation was carried out according to a new methodology, with the sequential suppression of various targets. First, the forward edge, then artillery positions, command posts, and enemy reserves. Air support for the operation also featured an innovative approach. Air armies operated not in isolation, but in close cooperation with ground forces. Aviation consistently solved the tasks of gaining air superiority, supporting the breakthrough, isolating the battlefield, and pursuing the retreating enemy. For the first time, the concept of an aviation offensive was successfully implemented, where airstrikes followed one after another without interruption, not giving the enemy a chance to restore control and regroup. The use of tank and mechanized formations was revolutionary. They were used not for direct infantry support, but as an independent strike force for developing tactical success into operational success. After breaching the enemy's defenses, Tank Corps rapidly advanced in depth, bypassing resistance nodes and intercepting the retreat routes of German troops. This allowed for the creation of several pockets, in which a significant part of Army Group Center was annihilated. Troop command and control during the operation also reached a new level. Front and Army commanders were located at advanced command posts, which allowed them to promptly react to changes in the situation. A clear system of interaction between various branches of service was established. The coordination of the actions of four fronts was carried out by Stavka representatives, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, which ensured unity of design and consistency of effort. An especially impressive achievement was the organization of supplies for the advancing troops. Railway units restored destroyed tracks at a speed of up to 10 kilometers per day, which allowed for timely delivery of ammunition, fuel, and provisions, even with the rapid advance of troops. Operation Bagration ended in catastrophic losses for the Wehrmacht. In just a few weeks, Army Group Center lost about 350,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured. This amounted to about 70% of the group's original strength. 28 divisions were completely destroyed, and another 6 divisions lost more than half of their personnel. 19 generals were captured, including 3 army commanders. German forces lost over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, about 10,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and over 57,000 vehicles. Soviet losses were also significant, about 180,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, which constituted about 8% of the forces involved in the operation. The Red Army lost about 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, about 3,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and about 800 aircraft. However, these losses were incomparable to the achieved results. The strategic consequences of Operation Bagration proved truly immense. Belarus was completely liberated, as well as a significant part of Lithuania and eastern Poland. Soviet troops reached the borders of East Prussia and the approaches to Warsaw. The front advanced 500 to 600 kilometers to the west. Germany lost a crucial strategic foothold in the east and was forced to transfer reserves from other directions, including from Normandy, where the Western Allies' offensive was unfolding at the time. This significantly eased the actions of Anglo-American forces and accelerated their advance deep into France. The moral impact of Operation Bagration on the warring parties is hard to overestimate. For the German command and ordinary soldiers, it became evidence of the inevitability of defeat in the war. Even the most convinced Nazis could no longer believe in the possibility of a favorable outcome. Defeatist sentiments grew within the German leadership, culminating in the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th. For the Soviet people and army, the success of the operation became a powerful moral stimulus. It strengthened confidence in the swift final defeat of the enemy and the return to peaceful life. Operation Bagration has forever entered history as one of the greatest strategic victories, not only of the Great Patriotic War, but of the entire Second World War. Its historical significance extends far beyond the liberation of Belarus and the defeat of Army Group Center. In terms of its scale, conception, and results, it became a true pinnacle of Soviet military art. Military historians from various countries are unanimous in their assessment of Bagration as an exemplary offensive operation. German General Kurt von Tippelskirch, who found himself a Soviet prisoner, called it the most terrible defeat in the history of the German army. British historian Richard Overy emphasized that it was on the Eastern Front, not in Normandy, that the fate of the war in Europe was decided. Particularly impressive is the comparison of Operation Bagration with the Allied landing in Normandy, which occurred at the same time. On the Soviet-German front, 30 enemy divisions were destroyed in 23 days, while Anglo-American forces defeated only 12 German divisions in 70 days of fighting in Normandy. Modern military analysts highlight several key lessons from Operation Bagration that remain relevant today. The first is the importance of strategic camouflage and disinformation of the enemy. The second is the necessity of concentrating forces in the directions of main strikes. The third is the effectiveness of deep enveloping maneuvers aimed at encircling the enemy. For military science, the experience of inter-service cooperation is of particular value. Bagration demonstrated how artillery, aviation, tanks, and infantry can act as a single, well-coordinated mechanism, multiplying each other's effectiveness. The memory of Operation Bagration is sacred to the peoples of Russia, Belarus, and other post-Soviet states. Monuments to the liberators have been erected in Minsk and other cities, and memorial complexes have been created at battle sites. Solemn events dedicated to this great victory are held annually. Operation Bagration became not just a military triumph, it changed the course of history, bringing closer the final defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Europe from fascism. Its study remains a vital part of military education worldwide, and the heroism of the participants in this grandiose battle will forever remain in the memory of grateful descendants.